Gal keletą. Let's wait for a few seconds while everybody takes their seats. Good morning once again, everybody. So, welcome to this event. I would like to start by inviting the head of the European Commission representation in Lithuania, Arnoldas Pranckevičius, to say a few words.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, dear ambassadors, dear vice ministers, dear regional mayors, dear colleagues from the Commission, welcome to Vilnius. Welcome to Europe House. We're meeting in very interesting times. Just one day before European Council tomorrow convenes in Brussels to discuss yet another request for extension on the very painful and tiring Brexit talks. We meet only 7 weeks before European Parliament elections, which will of course be a time of definition for our project, for the common European Union project that we all share. We meet just 3 weeks before this country, Lithuania, alongside with other 9 EU member states, will celebrate 15 years anniversary of membership in the European Union, marking, I would say, probably, arguably one of the most historical moments on this continent when East and West finally has reunited within the European family, and the artificially created borders by the other regimes were broken down. So in this context, of course, I think it's important not only to be distracted by our daily distractions, however painful they might be, but also to look a bit forward, to look into the future, to discuss the future perspective, not only of Europe, but also of this country, of Lithuania, in evaluating this 15 years of very successful transformation, and really a story of success, but also to see where Lithuania can do better and can benefit more from its membership, but also start not only receiving but also contributing to the common European project. So therefore the 2 subjects for today are very important. On the one hand, the country report, which every year we present to the Parliament and the government of this country and to the civil society and business community, and which every single year attracts a lot of attention, every single year attracts public comments by the President and the Prime Minister of this country, every single year receives the general agreement that the diagnosis of the European Commission is correct. However, always there's a bit of a disagreement how exactly to settle the issues which are being there outnumbered, from the increasing social exclusion and income gap to the structural problems that we still face in education and health sectors, and how to make sure that this very important macroeconomic success that Lithuania has been experiencing and a very solid economic growth can translate in a much higher welfare for the citizens and much better feeling for the society at large. At the same time, in the second half of today, you'll have a chance to discuss with a very high level expert team from the European Commission the future cohesion policy 2021-2027. As you know, already nearly 1 year ago in May, European Commission has presented the future EU budget proposal. We spent a lot of time discussing it, also here in Lithuania. Our representation went out of the capital to 10 cities, presenting the future MFF proposal in very much detail to all business communities in those cities. We presented it to the Parliament, to the government, to schools, to universities, and elsewhere. We had here, in this representation, a very interesting debate with the Director General Lemaitre on cohesion policy and with Director Haniotis on the future of the common agricultural policy. But the discussions are only intensifying and becoming heated as we go, especially as we're approaching the June European Council and the critical, probably, for the negotiations October European Council after European elections. So today you'll have a unique opportunity to discuss with the European Commission team headed by Deputy Director General for DG Regio, Normans Poppins, on exactly what it means for Lithuania and for the EU, and what is the rationale and philosophy behind European Commission's proposal in terms of cohesion. So I would like to wish you a very fruitful and interesting morning. As it is very cold outside, I hope that nobody will be tempted to leave this room. There will always be a very nice and hot coffee served outside of the room in case you need a bit of an energy. And I wish you very good, energetic, fruitful, forward-looking, and concentrated discussions.
For the opening speech, we would also like to invite Normans Poppins, Deputy Director General of European Commission, Directorate General for the Regional and Urban Policy. Welcome.
Oh, yes. Labas dienas. That's as far as my Lithuanian goes. I'm very happy to be in Vilnius in this rather chilly morning, which is the start of spring in our countries. But I'm very happy because, as always, we are at the very important period of time. And I feel that whenever I start a speech, I say we are at a very important junction in terms of implementation of European structural funds. And it's true. It's either the start of negotiations, either the beginning of absorption, middle of law absorption, closure of something. And so for the moment, it's closure of 713, almost second part of current period implementation. And today, officially, together with presenting the European semester recommendations, we are also launching again an informal dialogue with Lithuania on the post-2020 European structural funds and priorities in our investment programs. So I am very honored today to open this event because this is the first time that the Commission does together two events, which is launching and presenting a European semester staff working document and potentially leading to country-specific recommendations, and at the same time, back-to-back, also launching our informal dialogue on investment programs. And why are we doing that? It's only logic. The DG Regio, at least the DG MPOL and other fund DGs have worked already hard before within the European semester process, because as we all know, the European semester process is about to help member states to ensure sustainable development, economic development. How? To analyze and to make recommendations on what structurally needs to be changed, what kind of reforms need to be implemented, because we all know that economic growth is not about funding or money, it's also about conditions, it's about legislation, it's about the business environment, it's about reforms in such fields as education, health, and so on. And this is why it's only logic that the Commission now also, when it finishes the analysis on the European semester and presents country-specific recommendations, that it also matches the investment priorities where it is appropriate from the European structural funds also to these priorities, and see how we can help together to put in place and raise these priorities. But the aim of all this, obviously, is to ensure that the growth continues, because we know that Europe is in the 7th year of growth, but it's slowing down, and it depends on every one of us, on every member state, on every region, every city, every village, every functional area, as we now like to say, to really ensure that they can develop. And we are there with our programs to ensure that this potential is unlocked. And this is why we are together with European semester. And you will hear presentations from my colleagues from DG ECFIN and DG Employment in the first half of the day about this analysis and proposals. And you will ask them questions because I will have to work a little bit outside. But we will come back because the second half of the day will be devoted fully to launching event of the European Structural Funds. And there, together with my colleague, director from DG Employment, and my head of unit, Angela, we will be here and we will be able to answer all your questions related to the future of funds, the way that we see it, and we will be hoping to hear also your views, obviously. So just to say that the country report for Lithuania was published on the 27th of February, so it's been available. And the first part of today should focus on this country report. You know, with your analysis, with your reactions to this report, because obviously there's been already a process ongoing, a dialogue with the country, so we received recommendations. The point is, I think, to come up with something which is country-specific recommendations in the end. And I think what is also interesting in these country reports now, that we see that there is also more input related to investment analysis and also input related to analysis of regional disparities and, you know, of course, as always, on social disparities. And also, for the first time, we have so-called Annex D. It's not a D-Day, no, it's nothing to do with that, it's simply the ABCD, but it's the most important part of this piece, Annex D, because it sets out the way that we see where the investment in the future period should go within the context, obviously, of the staff working document and country-specific recommendations, and we will also try together to produce, actually, the CSR on investment for each member state. We are working on that, I believe, still. So we are open to to discuss with you all this. And yeah, I will not talk much. It's also not a secret that we are at the very critical stage in terms of MFF talks, which is our multi-annual financial perspective, Brexit. I don't know what's happening, and again, another extension today, probably, maybe not. But in any case, for us, it means that the budget will be lower at some point, and we have to better prioritize. And that means also we have to work harder on making sure that, first of all, the structural funds, which will probably remain one of the biggest parts of the EU budget, is used in a very efficient and targeted way. But Europe also has been helping with other instruments, and we have investment plan for Europe. We have big programs as Horizon 2020, the Connecting Europe facility. We try to introduce new programs, Digital Europe. There's a whole agricultural part, common agricultural policy. We also have to look in this context about the synergies, about all these instruments working better together. And this is why, you know, we are certainly in Regio, and I think in other fund DGs, the DG Employment and others, and hopefully it will happen even better, because even in this period we have created possibilities to combine different EU instruments to achieve better results. In future we want to make it simpler, we want to make it more logic and more natural to use different EU funds if you have a good result to be achieved, that it shouldn't be too complicated to choose the right instrument or even to combine the several instruments together. And this is also, I think, one of the features which we try to reinforce when we talk about investment in future. So it's linked to reforms. It's really helping country to unlock its potential and ensure these synergies, hoping that the multi-annual financial framework will finish on time with a good result to allow us to fund all these very important, in our minds, programs, because also if we talk about structural funds, we know that in many countries, and I believe in Lithuania too, it makes one of the largest part of public investment, and it's important to continue. Obviously, we always talk about, you know, reducing dependence on EU funds, and we have to think how we phase out in future, but I think for the moment, we have to make sure that what is available in the EU budget is used in the most efficient way. And for that, we will talk about in a second session. But obviously, it is important to look at everything in a context. So to me, it's very important to look at thematic priorities, but also equally importantly is to address real territorial challenges. And when we look at the growth and what hinders growth in our regions and member states, and we have done it in our DG because you might have heard we had this project on catching up regions where we analyzed the regions in middle income trap and also the ones who are very low compared to EU average. And you know, it's not availability of funding which really hinders the development. These are structural problems, particularly linked to labor market and education. So this is skills, this is people, this is ensuring that there is enough flexibility in the labor market. This is what hinders our regions from development and lack of innovation. And this is why innovation through our smart specialization strategy concept for the funds will be a #1 priority also in future. I want to mention it because to me, innovation is a driving force of economic growth, and we have to be able to stimulate it even if it doesn't seem like an, high-level Silicon Valley type of investment. We can innovate in tourism, in agriculture, in any field. If that's the strength of your region, of your territory, we should be able to support that. And this is why we will talk later on. We have been thinking a lot about how to enhance the territorial part of our funds, how to better use the current instruments, but in future also go for the new policy objective, which would aim at really targeting territorial needs, functional territories, and cooperation between different thematic fields under integrated territorial strategies. I want to thank you again for listening to me. I will be, as I said, back for the afternoon session, fully available to your questions. But now I would really like to give a floor to Director Mr. Angel, Angel, I don't know how you say that, but you are Director in ECFIN, and also Katarina, who is our Director in DG Employment. And they will run the show, the first part of the day. So good luck. And please ask them many questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Normans. So now I would like to invite Benjamin Angel, Director of Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. He is responsible for Treasury and Financial Operations, as well as economic surveillance of 11 EU member states, including Lithuania. Please.
Is it working? Yes. Vice Minister, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to present together with my colleague Katarina the country report for Lithuania. I will start by saying a few words on the key messages. Lithuania's growth performance has been impressive over the last decade, as was said by Norman. De facto, Lithuania has been the quickest catching up countries of all the European Union, moving from GDP per inhabitant average compared to the EU average of 50% up to close to 80% last year. In recent years, the growth performance has been pretty good, with an average around 3.6%, even though it's getting down a bit, as we will see in a couple of minutes. Employment has also increased quite dramatically. We have now an employment rate around 79% and an unemployment which has fell quite strongly to be below 6%. However, nothing is perfect, and we have noticed that Lithuania is still characterized by a very significant proportion of its population which is at risk of poverty, and inequality remain quite high. You also have this difficult characteristic of having seen your population shrinking quite dramatically by nearly 25% since the early 90s, and this has an impact, obviously, on the growth potential. Let's move maybe to the more detailed element. Starting with the growth situation. The main engine for growth, clearly, is domestic consumption. This domestic consumption is fueled by the quick progression of wages. Though investment has also progressed quite significantly in the recent period. The average growth was 7% in 2017-2018. The forecast from the Commission is that this growth will slow down. And it will slow down not because of domestic factor, but rather because of external factor. As you know, the international environment is not supportive. We are revising downward our growth forecast for virtually all geographies. There is a simultaneous slowdown in all parts of the world, in the US, in China, in Europe. And being a small open economy, Lithuania, by definition, is extremely sensitive to this general slowdown. So we expect growth to slow down to around 2.7% this year and 2.4% next year. But our growth forecast will be revised again soon, since we are in the process of updating it, and it's likely that the general trend at EU level and euro area level will not be that positive. Inflation is reducing. It has peaked at 3.7% in 2017. It has slowed down last year to 2.5%. We expect it to further moderate. And as I was discussing with a colleague just before, Lithuania is characterized by quite a dichotomy in the tradable and non-tradable sector. So the main driver behind inflation domestically remain the significant headline inflation coming from the service sector, the non-tradable sector. Looking at the situation of public finances, it remains quite good. Lithuania has generated a surplus since 2016, actually. The surplus was 0.6% in 2018. For this year, it is projected to halve at around 0.3%, but again, we will adjust our projection relatively quickly. The improvement in the fiscal situation has been driven primarily by the solid growth performance and by the strong consumer spending that boosted the tax income. The fiscal stance at the moment in Lithuania is slightly expansionary, and there is a relaxation of fiscal policy. The extent of this relaxation is a bit difficult to assess, and we will come back to it, but it is there. The debt to GDP ratio has also fallen quite significantly. It is around 36%, which is a good performance by EU standards. Where Lithuania is really different from most of the member states is in terms of taxation. First, Lithuania has clearly one of the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the EU. The total tax revenue to GDP actually is 10 percentage points below the EU average. The EU average is 39%. In Lithuania, it's only 29%. There are a number of factors that contribute to this tax situation. The first one is that a number of items of services which usually are taxed significantly in the EU are not taxed at all or barely taxed in Lithuania. That is the case for not taxed at all, for instance, for cars, or barely taxed, for instance, excise duty on diesel and other similar fossil fuels. The second characteristic is that until very recently you had a very low flat tax in terms of income. But you have also, I must say, a very unpleasant characteristic that call for certainly quick further action, which is a very low tax compliance. And this very low tax compliance is particularly visible for VAT. For VAT, the VAT gap, that is the VAT that is missing, is around 25%. that is a very high rate, which is well above the EU average. And this loss of tax income, by definition, reduces the capacity of the authority to use this income on other priorities. And one important priority for Lithuania would certainly be spending more on social benefit. Spending on social benefits in Lithuania is, again, well below the EU average. Lithuania spends, in average, around 11% of its GDP in social benefit. That is the lowest spending in the EU for social benefit. And it's far away from the second lowest. The second lowest is Ireland, and Ireland spends 18% on its GDP. Lithuania spends only 11%, and this clearly has an effect, which you can see on the graph which you have on the wall, where you can see the redistributive power of the public system and correcting the Gini coefficient. In Lithuania, this correction is extremely low. It's around 5 percentage point. It's among the weakest in the EU, which makes Lithuania an extremely unequal country. The share of the population at risk of poverty has been assessed in our social scoreboard as critical. I'm sure Katarina will come back in much more detail on this. You have nearly 30% of the population which is at risk of poverty, which is a huge proportion. The EU average is around 22%, and this average is masking actually the fact that we have a large number of member states in which this proportion is very, very low. So you have quite a dispersion to the average. Despite this, you have a very poor performance. The income of the richest 20% of the population is 7 times higher than the 20% poorer, while the average in the EU is around 5 times. So clearly, Lithuania is a much more unequal society in terms of income distribution than what we can see in the rest of the European Union. We know that the government clearly has it on its radar screen, and that the government intends to make effort to address it. The question is whether what is being implemented so far is sufficient to improve a bit the situation. There is a question mark, and the effect of the latest tax reform so far are expected to be relatively modest in terms of correcting inequality. Though modest in terms of correcting inequality, they may nevertheless need to some reduction in the tax income by close to 1%, so we have to see how this will be compensated. Looking a bit at the long term, pensions. There, I must say, the situation is quite unclear, and the title of this slide is probably relatively misleading because it does not reflect this unclarity. On the one hand, you have the new pension reform and the new indexation formula, which has been adopted in 2018, which links pension to the wage bill growth, which is expected to lower significantly the share of public pension expenditure to GDP from around 7% to around 5% in 2070. So as such, it would address significantly the issue of sustainability of pensions. But, and this is a very big but, I must say, this is done at the expense of the adequacy of the pension, since this is done primarily by reducing the benefit ratio. And this against the background where pensioners are already the part of the Lithuanian population which is the most at risk of poverty. I was saying that you have close to 30% of your population at risk of poverty. Actually, for pensioners, this proportion is around 40%, so it's a much higher. So if you reduce further the benefit, then you have one element in the law that foresees that the government has to take measures to correct problem of adequacy of pension. And this is the reason why I stated that we don't know very well, actually, whether the reform is increasing fiscal sustainability or not, because the paradox is that it is increasing fiscal sustainability if the future Lithuanian government, some decades from now, ignores the problem of adequacy of the pension, but then it would have to face a situation where many, many Lithuanians would have a very, very low pension. Or it is not improving the fiscal sustainability if you assume that the government, for obvious social and political reasons, would have to react and compensate this benefit issue. That's why the projection, actually, in terms of cost on the GDP, vary between 5%, which was the target of the reform, up to the double, 10%, in a scenario where the government would be correcting the loss of benefit. So big question mark on the sustainability of pension. Looking now at the banking sector, as you know, the Lithuanian banking sector is fairly concentrated. We have 3 banks, Swedbank, SEB, and Luminor, which have more than 80% of the market. The situation of the bank is sound. The NPL rate is very low. It's around 2.3%. The capital ratios, the CET Tier 1 is around 18%, which is quite good. The profitability is among the best in Europe. The problem are more to be found in the difficulties of access to financing of SMEs. In that sense, Lithuania is a bit an outlier, not a spectacular one, but a bit of an outlier. If we ask SMEs whether they had problem of access to finance, you have 13% of Lithuanian SMEs which says, yes, we have this problem. That's almost a double in terms of proportion that the average answer that we get in the European Union. And when we see more closely the SMEs that declare that they got the financing, but not as much as they wanted, so financing issues, still this proportion grows to 40%, which is pretty high, I must say. So this is certainly worth exploring further, and we had discussion actually with banks yesterday trying to understand it better, whether it's risk aversion from the banking sector, whether it's a problem of availability of collateral, whether it's a question of length of the insolvency procedure and the difficulty to repossess the collateral in Lithuania. There might be a variety of reasons behind it, but it clearly shows that there is a growth potential here that can be tapped further. Sorry, I forgot to say on the banking sector and banking situation 2 things. There is an increased attention at European level on AML, anti-money laundering. As you have seen, that is a problem that we are experiencing in a high number of countries, including countries that were perceived so far as a perfect beacon of virtue, like Sweden or Denmark. The fact that some large Swedish banks, which are very present in Lithuania, have experienced this kind of difficulty certainly warrant an extra attention from the Lithuanian authorities. On the one hand, you have the advantage of having a rather low share of non-resident depositors, especially if you compare to Latvia. But you have to keep in mind that the last evaluation done by Moneval, which is the evaluation done within the umbrella of the Council of Europe, has produced relatively mixed result. So it really called for further attention from the Lithuanian authorities to make sure that the country does not experience the same level of difficulties as the one which has been encountered in other countries of the region. Changing completely off topic now, that's sorry for this very varied presentation, but that's the nature of the country report to be a bit touche à tout, as we would say in French. Housing market. The supply of new housing in Vilnius and its suburbs has reached post-crisis high, de facto, and the stock of unsold apartments in the three largest cities has started to increase since the beginning of 2017. The demand remains strong. This is due to the fact that monetary policy is still very accommodative in the area, so you can borrow cheaply, and that the growth of wages is still pretty strong, around 9% in Lithuania. So this leads to a situation where you have a mortgage growth of around 8%, which is pretty high. As you know, in Lithuania, mortgage is only a fraction of the financing of properties in general, since you have this unusual characteristics of having only 40% of housing purchase funded by bank lending, while in most EU member states, the proportion is more than double this one. The situation is far from being worrying. Actually, the debt level of the household in Lithuania is the lowest of the European Union, with a level of only 26%. And when we look at the situation of the housing market with some metrics, it does not show any overvaluation. I have to be careful, actually, because when we were in Sweden to present the country report a couple of weeks ago, I noticed that the overvaluation in Stockholm, depending on the model, was ranging from 5% up to 50%. So the only thing I could tell the Swedish authority is that there is an overvaluation. How much? No clue. But in Lithuania, the models do not show such overvaluation. In terms of wages and progression of the labor cost now, there's a situation is positive, but calls for attention. It is positive because Lithuania is still experiencing catching up of the wages, which is certainly needed. The wage progression has been very strong, more than 9%. But you have to keep in mind that this wage progression has been quicker than the progress in labor productivity. And that is not something that can continue forever. So far, it did not have any significant impact because it has been absorbed primarily by a margin compression from businesses, so they make less profit. But such a quick wage increase not in line with labor productivity compensated by a reduction in profit would at some point either lead to insufficient profit leading to low investment, which would have a toll on growth, or loss of competitiveness for the Lithuanian companies and increase in export prices. So far, so good, but pay attention because the current trend is not sustainable. The labor productivity has increased significantly, nevertheless, one should be fair. It reaches now 35% of the EU average, that is 35 percentage points above the situation in 2000. But it is something to monitor very quickly. In terms of investment, there the situation in Lithuania is not satisfactory. The volume of investment as a percentage of GDP is too low, clearly. Lithuania has an investment to GDP ratio of around 19%. In new member states, the proportion is usually around 25%. And actually, if you want to keep on catching up, you need a sustained, prolonged, high level of investment to be able to do it. This investment is held back by a number of factors that we will look into now. That could be gathered in around two priorities. The first one is investing in human capital. Clearly, the Lithuanian economy is suffering from skill shortages and mismatches. The skill shortages have multiple sources. The most obvious one has been the shrinking population, where very often the population that emigrated from Lithuania was the highly skilled part, which increased attention domestically. But there is also clearly a question of skill mismatch. It is not that the Lithuanian population is not trained enough. Actually, you have one of the highest percentage of the population reaching university degree in Europe. It's rather the question of the adequacy of this training with the needs of the economy. And there is clearly, according to all our indicators, a skill mismatch in Lithuania, where the profile of people trained by university is different from what the economy would need, which call also for some attention. The school outcomes are also below the EU average, so there is sometimes a problem of quality of the education. I know that the government is making effort, notably to regroup university, which is a good thing, but those efforts need to be stepped up. The health situation is also pretty poor. I will not enter into much detail because I know Katarina will, but the life expectancy is clearly among the lowest in the EU, and the mortality rate is well above the EU average. Second big priority, innovation. Lithuania is not a very innovating economy. Actually, it is ranked at being only at 70% of the EU average. The innovation intensity of the private sector is very low. The public sector is financing research innovation, primarily thanks to the help of the EU fund. The private sector could do much better. I know it is difficult for a small economy which have a strong SME tissue as Lithuania to have good performance in terms of research and innovation, because research clearly is an area where scale does matter. You cannot finance the same thing when you're a small SME and when you have very large companies. But still, there are EU instruments like Innofin, for instance, which are here particularly to help financing innovative SMEs. So it certainly encourages the Lithuanian banks to offer those products more aggressively and more systematically. The cooperation between the science and businesses is also quite low. Third priority, resource efficiency. The energy consumption is increasing strongly in Lithuania, and clearly additional efforts are needed to meet the national target for preventing climate change. As in all countries of the region, a very important source of progress could be investing more in the resource efficiency of the buildings. Building insulation, notably. There is still a large stock of inefficient housing and public buildings that needs to be tackled. There is also clearly a transport issue in terms of energy consumption. Lithuania is extremely dependent on cars. And if you look at the railways, only 6% of the railways are connected to electricity. And the others are using fossil fuels. So the whole transport system in Lithuania is not climate change friendly. and that certainly called for further actions from the Lithuanian authorities. Waste management is also a challenge, despite the fact that it is progressing. Connectivity should also be improved. Lithuania has a very low international connectivity in terms of rail, road, maritime, and air. There are some projects which have been in the air ever since Lithuania joined the European Union, like Rail Baltica, for which few progress has been made so far. And upgrades are needing also to other projects such as Via Baltica highways. In the context of the North Sea Baltic corridor, 44 projects have been identified with a total investment need of around 4 billion over the period 2016-2030. The bulk of this focuses on the Via Baltica highway and the electrification of the rail network. Clearly, more needs to be done. Last, regional disparity. They're pretty strong in Lithuania. I'm sure you will have ample occasion to discuss it when we discuss the priority for the use of structural funds for the next MFF period and the Annex D in the country report. This is not Lithuanian specificity. This time, I must say, being in charge of 11 countries, which for nearly all of them are new member states, this is really something that we see in most new member states, with very, very few exceptions. But it is pretty strong in Lithuania. Actually, if you look at Vilnius plus Kaunas together, they represent 66% of the Lithuanian GDP. So there is an extreme disparity between this region, which is, as you can see, at the EU average, and or even above the EU average, and region of the Northwest, which are at nearly half of the EU average. So basically, there are two different Lithuania in which to live in terms of standard of living, and we see also this disparity going beyond pure economic consideration, because the difference in the standard of living mean also differences in the attractiveness, and therefore the rate at which the population is shrinking is much quicker in poor regions than in regions that have quite a wealthy standard of living. I will stop my presentation there. Katarina has a lot of things to say to complement it. I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm very happy to take questions later on. The European semester is clearly a discussion process. We are not here to prescribe solutions. We are here to help you identify the problems. The solution to this problem needs to be discussed primarily nationally with vast consultation with stakeholders and social partners to make sure that there is a collective ownership on the solution to be addressed so as to anchor Lithuania on a successful road to growth and economic real convergence for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So I'm pretty sure that all of us have many questions. So we would like to invite audience to take their smartphones and go online on slido.com and enter the keyword Euro. So you will get access to a page where you can submit questions throughout the two presentations which we will hear. We will answer these questions during question and answer session later. We would also like to hear your opinion. What is most important in your view in Lithuania? So we have opened a poll in slido.com, and we would like to ask you, in which of the following policy areas reforms should be prioritized in Lithuania? And there you can see several areas which were already mentioned by Benjamin. So please be active, please vote. So slido.com, the code Euro. And now I would like to invite Ms. Katarina Ivankovic-Knezevich, Director of the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. She's responsible for the social protection systems and wider social policies that promote inclusion. She's also responsible for the monitoring and support for social policies in 8 member states, including Lithuania, if I'm correct.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and let's open the...
So hello to you all from all of us from DG Employment, and I think Benjamin had an amazing introduction into the not only employment and social policy, but also the whole field related to human resources, I would say. And indeed, if you want to catch up with everything, with the investments, with the productivity, indeed we need to invest in people, because in the end, the people are those that are driving the development. And if we take the fact that Lithuanian years in the EU are exactly at the age of teenager becoming an adolescent, where he or she really knows what he or she wants. And I think with the figures that we saw, the economic figures, which are indeed nothing but really good, so to speak, and we speak only in superlatives when we say, but still the challenges are here, which will determine where Lithuania will take the next step. And this next step is important, and it's important for various aspects. And I will start with some of them, and I will show you, try to explain you how we see the employment, social, and educational policies within the Lithuania, what we see as a good aspects, and what we still see as the remaining challenges. There is no secret that the population is shrinking. If you look at the data for latest 10 to 15 years, we see that population, we don't have those data here on the graph, but population has significantly dropped for half a million. The good thing, I would say, in all of this, that in the last 2 years we see the number of those returning to Lithuania is increasing. The number of also third country nationals is increasing in a way under your very controlled environment, but still the big immigration represents a significant challenge for not only Lithuanian economy, but also for Lithuanian society in general. This slide and this graph that you see on the wall is, I would say, extremely worrying, because if the figures continue like this, then we would really face, and I think in 2038 or 36, we would come to the fact that Lithuania will have less than 2 million of inhabitants, which is, I think, extremely worrying factor. And this is the decisive moment where we say what we want to do with Lithuania and what we do with EU funds. And this afternoon we are going to discuss about next financial perspective. But in order to secure that something changes on this graph is only prediction. It doesn't have to be this way. But if we want to change something, then we have to do something. So the challenges that refer to the labor market, and I'll speak about that a little bit later, are mostly because of the lack of certain professions. We see that the construction sector, that all the services are experiencing the deficit. And we also see the fact of skills mismatch, and Benjamin spoke a lot about it, and a lot about how it reflects to the overall economic development. The labor market challenge and the labor market use of the full potential, as we say. Sometimes I ask myself how far we can go, how far more you can go. The figures, the recent figures that we have are between 78 and 80% of the employment rate. This is extremely high, and this comes us to the situation that we will ask ourselves, do we have anybody else to employ? And whom are we going to employ, and how and why? The unemployment is declining. It's 6%. Now it's in the range of 2007, so the year before the crisis, and 2008 was as well quite low. Then it only increased in 2010 a bit. So could it decrease even more? And where is the workforce? If we take also the fact that we have, and the large slide that Benjamin showed was about the regional disparities, here we have, within the workforce, we have the huge regional disparity of 14% gap between employment in the cities and employment in the rural areas. So this is definitely something to have in mind. But we see also some groups that might, and some cohorts that might require additional attention. And this is particularly persons with disabilities, because the ratio of employed persons with disabilities is much lower than the one in the average European Union. But we also see some potential in low-skilled working age population, which we know it's quite low in Lithuania, but we still see that their employment rate, their activity rate, and then something what is very important is that the results and the achievements of their children are the one the EU average, but have really long consequences if not addressed properly. When it comes to the social policy, we can agree with well, the average of the EU is 22%. We see that income inequality is one of the highest in the EU, and when we will look at the next slide, which will show the scoreboard, I will explain you a little bit where is the critical situation and what we need to work on. Nevertheless, and many times it has been mentioned by my colleague, but I will repeat it, that the Lithuanian expenditure on social protection is quite low, and public pensions are one of the lowest of the EU, and this will be definitely the remaining challenge, and this will be something that in the future we will look when we look to the pension adequacy. And you know that the European Commission looks every 3 years publish the pension adequacy report, and in the last report we have highlighted the importance of securing adequate pensions for all the pensioners receiving them, and we are fully aware of the challenges, especially of those who have really short working years and who haven't worked the whole working life, but the challenges had to be addressed, and the adequacy leads then to another consequences such as health challenges, such as long-term care challenges. So in a way it is all connected. This amazing scoreboard and our traffic lights, almost traffic light, shows how well we are in addressing challenges defined and values defined in the European Pillar of Social Rights. And you know that we have all proclaimed together the Pillar of Social Rights in 2017 in Gothenburg, and for the last 2 years we have been monitoring how the Pillar principles have been implemented in our member states, and the Pillar has 20 principles, but 14 big indicators that we watch and that we watch upon when we look how the social policy is implemented in the member states. Why is this? Why is it important? You know that the whole economic European semester process started from our ECFIN colleagues who wanted to see a big picture when it comes to the economic development, employment data, etc., etc. Commission for last few years was trying really to put the social perspective highly on the agenda. we tend to believe that we managed and succeeded to put it really high on the agenda, because behind, and as I said at the beginning, behind all those big data, there are people driving the whole process, and we have to look at the social policy as contributor to the investment, contributor to the productivity and to the development of the society. So there are some of the indicators that you are really better than the average or best performers, and I will speak a little bit later about our educational system, where you have really the lowest numbers of early school leavers. I think the only country that has the lowest figure is my own member state, which is Croatia. So in this field, both of them are doing extremely well, and this is a tradition of really attainment of children in the obligatory educational system. Your best performance also in the household market income adjusted for taxes and social transfer, which is the GDHI per capita growth, and you're also excellent in the employment rate. When it comes to the employment rate, nevertheless, and we compare it and we see it in all of our member states, we look also at the employment rate of women, which is the largest in Lithuania, and also you don't have the gender pay gap. And the gender pay gap exists, but gender employment gap is below 1%, which is really an example to look upon, and this is something that we cherish and appreciate a lot, and we see it as your big advantage. But when it comes to gender segregation gap, then we can still discuss if women are working in less paid occupations and taking jobs that are less paid, such as teachers, social workers, nurses, etc., and many other services as well. So what do we look? We have to look people at the risk of poverty. The AROPE index, which I already said, is quite high and almost the highest in the EU. And also this indicator called income quintile ratio, which shows that the income of richest 20% of the population or households was more than 7 times higher than the one of the poorest 20%. So this is this big difference, and this is really something that we would express as the critical situation. When it comes to the other indicators, we also, and closely linked also to the poverty and to the reduction of the poverty and to the public spending and the division of public spending, is the impact of social transfers, and one of the others is children aged less than 3 years in formal childcare. I guess the children indicator has also something to do with, I would say, really generous system of benefits, where women, mothers in Lithuania, for the first year get 100% up to the certain level, and then second year 70%, and the third year I think it's around 40%, and you indeed have quite many women that stay out of the labor market for quite some time. And yesterday in the plane I had a discussion with a young mother of 14 who was explaining me how she feels that now when a child is almost a year and a half she should go back to work, but it is to be seen if the child will get the place in the childcare institution or if she would find somebody to work with. So the question of at what time should mothers return to work is really something that has to be very carefully discussed and carefully thought. And also it is to see how much is the system supporting women to return to the labor market or preventing women to return to the labor market. And you all know that just last week we have adopted at the European level our directive for the work-life balance, which establishes 2 new instruments at the European level. One is paternity leave, which says that fathers have certain number of days along with the mother to take care of the little ones, and also carers leave, which is for the first time that we set it as the instrument at the EU level, that persons taking care of dependent household members, so it's not only children, it's those that are living in a household together, 4 or 5 days per worker per year. And also another important instrument that exists in various other legal acts, but first time put in this perspective is the flexible working arrangements, which will provide young parents or not so young parents or those taking care of dependent members to have some kind of flexible working arrangement. I think this would be just enough of the scoreboard. Healthcare. I don't have a really good news on the healthcare. And when you look at the graph, we see that the life expectancy really differs if you are man or woman in Lithuania. The life expectancy of men is really the lowest in the EU, and we can see it's, if I can read these small letters, it's 69.5 years, while for the women is a bit higher, it's 80 years. And you see at the European level that the difference exists in various member states. But what is very worrying for us, and what we saw in also your analysis and your documents and in the researches that were available to us, that there is really a big mortality due to cardiovascular diseases or, unfortunately, suicides, and mainly among men, and it's more than 2 times higher than the EU average. Also, the issue of the healthy lifestyle is in question. And when we look at as the general, the life expectancy rate is 6 years below the EU average, and this huge gender gap, I think, definitely puts us in the position that we have to see how are we going to address our aging population, and how are we going to implement the measures in the next period. And we will speak in the afternoon about possibilities that ESF Plus and the other funds are providing in this area as well, and this is definitely something to look upon. And if we take into account that the pension or the retirement age is 65, then it's really worrying factor. The other aspect is the affordability of healthcare, and the topic not dear to all of us, I'm sure not dear to all of you, is the out-of-pocket payments, which are still very high and which are also among one of the highest out-of-pocket givings in the EU, which of course is closely then in the link of the poverty challenges and of the fact that aging population has less funds to spend on these topics, and then the vicious circles just close. We also see that there is imbalances in the health workforce. Fortunately, we don't see huge challenges when it comes to the lack but it's closely getting there when it comes to the doctors. We see that many nurses are leaving. We know that you had a 10-year program prepared for the health reform and the overall master plan of the health reform, and it's of course going slowly and gradually. We acknowledge improvements in the educational and training system of the doctors and in specializations and in this field, but I think additional effort would be needed also to address the really challenge when it comes to the nurses, and also when it comes to good professional orientation of young teenagers, not young teenagers, but teenagers coming to going to the university to involve and to enroll in such professions. When it comes to the education and skills, I would only compliment what my colleague has said. you indeed have one of the largest and one of the highest attainment in the European Union. It's almost 60%, it's 57.6%, which means actually that everybody who wants to go study can study, and the system is quite well designed, although the attainment of, for example, students with disabilities is quite low. And for us, and especially for me, dealing with the social policy, which has the disability and inclusion in the portfolio, this is an important topic to be addressed. And the gap between people with and without disabilities is 28%, while the average EU gap when it comes to the tertiary studies is 13%, so it's more than double when it comes to the person's disability and actually their ability to undertake the study. We still see the challenges when it comes to the quality of education and differences at the regional level, and the network of institutions that would secure qualitative and good outcome educational results is quite challenging. Unfortunately, PISA results are not the best. They show that they are really below the average, and this data have been increasing, but not in the right way since 2012. So it seems also that the educational system needs to address and needs to adapt also to the new techniques, new learning challenges, new skills, the whole new skills agenda actually that should taken on board. We know that you did a lot for the VET system, for the improvement and for the education of VET students. Many activities were supported by the funds, and this is the good way, and this is the good way to continue in the future. And also we will in a future time, but not only in Lithuania, I think now when this is the last week of the semester missions, and all of us who have been seeing many member states, and in my directorate we have 8 of them, we could see some patterns all around the EU, no matter how well or less developed the member state is, and that is the fact that adult learners still do not have the attention that it is needed, and that is one of the reasons that upskilling and reskilling are going to be discussed in the future much more than it has been done before. When it comes to the adult learning, your coverage is around 6%, 6.5% in 2018. EU average is 11.1%, but the upskilling and reskilling in most of the countries is seen as the upskilling, reskilling of the unemployed or those that represent really the disadvantaged cohorts. But we would like in the future to speak more about upskilling and reskilling of employed, so that people who are either with lower qualification needed for job or have faced different challenges during their lifetime and during their work time, to be able to involve and to be able to attain the different levels of upskilling. There are several initiatives, even such as, and Benjamin knows it because French did a great deal with securing that each employed person has the right for the different upskilling and reskilling exercise. And I'm sure that sometimes in the future, the whole EU is going to come to this idea. And in the end, when it comes to the human capital, I would say, and you can see it on a slide, what we have put and what we will discuss in the afternoon when it comes to the future funds priorities. But I would say that you maybe have a good reply for these challenges, which is called six-pack. And six-pack has a different meanings, different associations you might have on the six-packs. But for me, from now on, it will be only addressing the Lithuanian the reform program, actually, so to speak, that you want to address education, healthcare, taxation, pensions, innovation policy, and reduction of shadow economy. I think if all of these aspects, of course, modified if needed, what is working, what is not working should be and could be improved, but if you take it on board and if you really deliver well on what has been proposed and what has been seen, I think our six-pack is going to be firm and strong, and that's what we all should look upon, and that's how we all should take a stock and how we should see the social and employment policy to develop in the future. I guess we will have time for questions now, and thank you.
Once again, if you want to ask any question, please go on slido.com. Now we will close the poll, so the website will be dedicated only for the questions. And now I would like to invite the representative of Lithuanian government, Marius Kuodis, Vice Minister of Ministry of Economy and Innovation. Ministry of Economy and Innovation is Commission's key partner in Lithuania as it coordinates the national part of the European semester, including the preparation of the national reform program. Please come, it will be very interesting to hear your views.
Good morning. It's still morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and at the same time, it's one of the biggest challenges to react to all your recommendations, I would say, and it's really impossible to say something contradictory. I can only agree. And since when listening, I understood my reaction will be bad and will be criticized a lot. So I decided to put my notes aside and will try to improvise a little bit. In any case, I would like to start by asking a rhetorical question. What determines whether reforms are and recommendations of the Commission or other international organizations, whether reforms are implemented or not, and what determines their success? And if we look at all the recommendations of the Commission and how they were implemented over the period of 2011-2017, you can see that, according to the European Commission, only 9% of all the recommendations were implemented fully. And the biggest part is here. With 44% of all recommendations, European member states achieved some progress. If we compare the EU with Lithuania, we look a little bit better. And I am happy for that. Because here, with full implementation, we have 12%, and here, around 60%. Having said that, it's not sufficient. And I always keep asking the question myself, so what determines whether recommendations are implemented or not? One of the answers that I give to myself is also another question: what is the most scarce resource in politics? Some people say it's money. My answer is political attention. It's the most scarce resource. So if you want to deliver something, you need to focus your attention. And then you can ask, to what extent the recommendations are focused, and to what extent our response is focused too. And here we have a lot of challenges. A little bit about Lithuania at a glance. What happened last year? Last year, one of our biggest achievements was to join the OECD. And I wanted to mention that because we implemented a major reform of our state-owned enterprises. The European Commission kept noticing that, but starting from last year, we have no longer politicians sitting on boards of state-owned enterprises. When the government started its term, we had more than 120 state-owned enterprises. At the moment, we have around 60, and the number will be decreased substantially. So OECD helped to achieve that. At the same time, we reached the highest position in the famous Doing Business ranking, and we will keep improving here, especially if the Parliament adopts the insolvency reform and so on. We will move upwards. We are happy that our investment promotion agency attracted the highest number of FDI projects in Lithuania. And we are especially happy that IBM sees us as the third country globally by the added value of working places created by those projects. Ireland is, I think, the first, so congratulations. You show us an example, Singapore the second, if I'm not mixing, and we are the third. At the same time, we are especially happy about this trend. Last year, we had the largest immigration to Lithuania since 90s. Net migration decreased by 88%. It's difficult to say whether it's a trend, but hopefully it is. And just to remind what Benjamin also noticed, in 2000, our GDP per capita was 37% of the EU average. Now it's almost 80%. If the trend continues, and it depends on a lot of things, we should reach the EU average in 2035. We would like to reach the average in 2030. But of course, a lot depends, and a lot needs to be done to be there. Of course, mathematically, given a migration and population decline, this number is higher than it could be otherwise. And of course, the growth of GDP doesn't say anything about how income is distributed. And now I will try to go very quickly and only on the surface. Regrettably, it's impossible to do everything, in a short period of time. And to touch a little bit different areas that were mentioned by the Commission. Taxation, shadow economy, pensions, education, health, and innovation system. It's responsibility of my ministry, so I can talk a lot about that. There were calculations made, and I know one of the authors, I see one of the authors of the calculation that if all the reforms are implemented and all the measures, our GDP should be around 2% higher in 2025, 2027, in comparison to the scenario without those reforms. So now, taxation and shadow economy. The European Commission kept saying and pointing out the taxation of labor, and kept asking whether taxation is not too high in Lithuania. The government reacted. We consolidated the employer and employee base for social security contributions. At the same time, the ceiling was also introduced. The ceilings are very high at the moment, and they will be decreased in the following 2 years. At the same time, we expanded the limits on the application of non-taxable income, also introduced progressive personal income taxation in relation to the ceiling of social security contributions. So these changes helped to increase personal income a little bit. At the same time, the Commission also noted a number of things about shadow economy. And the government, I see representatives from the Ministry of Finance, put a lot of efforts fighting that. Creating incentives not to participate. For instance, starting from this year, you can reduce your taxable income if you paid officially for repairing your car or for childcare and so on. And there are some numbers. The calculations of the Ministry of Finance show that VAT gap was decreased by 2.6% from 2016 to 2017, and this trend is forecasted to continue. So if you were interested, probably my colleagues could comment on that. Social exclusion and poverty. The European Commission correctly notices and mentions all the time that there are a number of groups that are at the highest risk. Older people, disabled, and families with one parent. So in reaction to the latter group, we introduced the universal child benefit system. And the Commission sees that positively, only in terms of decreasing inequality for families with only one parent. At the same time, we also increased in reaction to what to do with the situation for older people. Of course, the response is to increase the pensions, the first natural response. So they were increased, and in relation to the reform of the pension, it's also a positive thing that we indexed pensions to the wage fund, so the trend will continue. Also, you mentioned the disabled people, and also our ministry so now is involved in discussions what to do with that, because my personal observation is also that we have different parts of the system. How to integrate the disabled people into the labor market. What we need to do better is to integrate all the parts and at the same time to work with incentives for the disabled, for employers, and so on. Demographic challenges. The Parliament approved the demographic migration integration policy strategy. It's a long-term document which tries to address all the related challenges horizontally. At the same time, it's not mentioned here, but our ministry pays a lot of attention, and we are trying to focus our efforts on upskilling people in the labor market, and at the same time, we're in constant conversation with the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor on requalification. And a lot has been done in this area too. I would also like to mention the migration policy. Tomorrow, the government will discuss major changes in our legislation. The idea behind those changes is basically if we want to attract talents, they should come to Lithuania as easy as possible. Education, probably one of the most difficult topics. The attention in different areas, from higher education to primary education, is here. How to improve working conditions for teachers and researchers. The focus should be here. At the same time, I also see my colleague, former minister, Vice Minister of Education, who started the reform of the university network. This year we will start the reform of our colleges network too. Regarding the skills mismatch and how to match the education system compliance with labor market needs, last year we also started to distribute funding for higher education, for the IT system and so on, according to the needs of the labor market. And this year we will continue. And probably I will stop here in this area. Healthcare. The European Commission also, kept mentioning many times how much we spent in different areas in comparison to the EU average. So in the area of healthcare, our expenditure is lower than the EU average, and it naturally creates a lot of challenges here. But the rational use of available resources is probably one of the priorities. And legislation is prepared how to, for instance, consolidate certain services in high-quality centers. It's one of the answers. Another area to focus on is reducing imbalances of health workers in regions and also increasing the retention of specialists, the attraction of specialists, and so on. So here we also are talking about salaries. The Ministry of Health also put a lot of personal emphasis on increasing the availability of medicines, and so on. And also, a lot of things are happening in this area, and a lot of things will be done. And now when it comes to innovation, this is one of the priorities of our ministry. Last year, the Parliament decided that the Ministry of Economy and Innovation, therefore we changed the name, adding the term innovation, will be responsible for innovation policy in Lithuania. Now we need to, this year, to present to the Parliament the long-term strategy of science, technology, and innovation development. A lot of work is being done to create a legal basis for creating one innovation support fund in Lithuania. Preparation is also taking place in reaction to the European Commission recommendations, IMF recommendations, OECD recommendations, how to consolidate the innovation ecosystem in Lithuania by probably creating one implementing innovation agency. Because you can see different slides. When we compare us with Israel, it's very nice to see how many institutions in Lithuania we have working in this area, when Israel has only one. How many documents we have in Lithuania, when Israel has only one umbrella document. And it will give an answer. Also, we put a lot of emphasis on life sciences industry. The government approved a strategy how to increase the contribution of this sector to our GDP from 1% to 5% by 2030. And now the government is going to approve the action plan how to reach this goal. And also, Benjamin mentioned about smart specialization program. So we reviewed it in order to make it more focused. Digital policy. Also, starting from last October, the Ministry of Economy and Innovation became responsible for digital agenda of the government. Before that, responsibilities were dispersed among different ministries, at least 4 bodies. Now, there is only one institution to be blamed for everything what is happening in this area. We are working on consolidating consolidation of the public information resources infrastructure in order to decrease expenditure by at least 30%. At the same time, the open data program that we started is expected, at least there are some calculations that if we manage to open all the data that is needed by the public sector, it could add around 2% to our GDP. Also, we have recently presented our artificial intelligence strategy, which is also one of the areas for the future, and all the countries in the European Union need to present one by the middle of the year. And there are also other initiatives in different areas in which we are trying to move forward as quickly as we can. Industry. If we compare Lithuania with other Baltic countries, industry is much more important to the GDP in Lithuania in comparison to Latvia and Estonia. It creates around 20% of our GDP and responsible for around 80% of our all exports. But here we also have different challenges. And one of the main ones is digitalization of the industry, or how to increase productivity in the sector. But we are happy that together with the European Commission and also OECD, we created 5 strategic directions how to digitalize our industry. At the same time, we already have guidelines and action plan what to do in this area. And we are now trying to focus funding, EU funding, in this area to reach our goals too. What we are happy about that we were one of the first countries in the EU that created the so-called Lithuanian Industry 4.0 platform. And it's a very important platform because it's a forum for government officials, for businesses, community, and also academic community to discuss all the issues related to digital transformation, to industry transformation, and to agree on the necessary actions that needs to be taken here. And I especially wanted also to stress the startup ecosystem. It's becoming more and more vibrant. If you looked at the number of startups that we have in Lithuania, we have around 500. And we want to double the number in 2 years. Because it's related with innovation, it's related with industry, with everything. It can give one of the answers to what we need to do with the economy. And the system is becoming more and more dynamic. The number of startups is growing. If you look at the funding attracted by them, it's increasing. We had the help of the EU. We established 10 venture capital funds / accelerators that are already operating in Lithuania or started its operation, some from the beginning of this year. Also, a lot of emphasis is being put on the fintech sector in Lithuania. We have around 170 fintechs in this country, and the growth of the sector last year was 45%. And my final slide, a little bit about investments. So I already mentioned that last year was historic for Lithuania. And we are happy that FDI attracted to Lithuania is quite balanced in terms of what we attract to the services sector, manufacturing sector, and also technology companies. In my personal view, this is also one of the answers what to do with our regional policy and regions. And we see in some regions, when a big player comes when it changes all the dynamic that is happening there. Salaries start increasing. People, and you correctly mentioned that although unemployment rate is low in Lithuania, but we have serious regional disparities. So people start coming to the region, the services sector is boosted, and so on and so forth. So we have some positive examples, and we should continue with that. Now we are also working on this direction to create certain conditions for better conditions for attracting large manufacturers to Lithuania, and we will continue with that. I will stop here. I know that I was not able to address all the challenges, of course, but my colleagues are sitting here, and I know that we can move to the Q&A session, and we could look at some of the issues much closer. So thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much, Marius. So now I would like to invite speakers to join the panel, as well as Michele Calandrino, the leader of a country team, which was responsible for the preparation of a country report and the country-specific recommendations. Maybe you could sit there. I will check that. So let's look what are the results of our poll. So yeah, our question was, in which of the following policy areas reforms should be prioritized in Lithuania? We had 70 answers, so participants were quite active, and we see the results. So 61% of audience think that education is priority in Lithuania. It is followed closely by social sphere, income inequality, poverty, and social exclusion. And the third one is innovation. We see that the least important are seen public finance and business environment. So I would like to ask panel, do you think that this assessment of our audience, does it reflect the country report and the problems highlighted there? What would you think?
Maybe I can start because we are the number one. So I think the results only show that the audience deeply recognizes what are the remaining challenges and what are the advantages. I don't think that the public policy and public financing is really least important. I think it shows that they are a bit more stable and that they're really delivering on the expected results, but the remaining challenges that stay, this is really what is visible on the screen, and this is really where the future investment needs to be undertaken. It is indeed, the education is extremely important in the various aspects, and we have been speaking about it today. We will speak about it in the afternoon to see where the future funds are going to be invested. And if you say you want to reach 100% by 2035, I believe, 30. Okay, but 35 was on the slide. So this means you have two financial perspectives to do something with it. And if we look that, for example, the funds, utilization of funds in Lithuania was around 2% of the GDP, then even with increasing productivity and the better use of the EU funds, we could really contribute, and the EU funds could contribute to this. So I think the priorities are set right.
Marius, maybe you would like to say your view.
If I just could add one thing, it's very strange. I fully agree that education should be the priority. Then, you know, innovation system is related, social inclusion too. The challenge here that all the fields are related and interlinked. And it was interesting to see public finances as the least prioritized area because it's directly linked with the first one too. Of course, efficiency is one of the areas that we are trying to focus at the moment. The optimization of, universities network, and so on and so forth. But public finances also can give a lot of answers how to reach those goals.
Yeah, I was about to answer in the same direction, actually. Many of the policies which are listed can see improvement via efficiency gains, but some need more financing, period, like social benefit, for instance. And in this respect, you should pay attention to public finances. And I'm saying this not only because I come from DG ECFIN, which has a well-known obsession for public finances, but because tax collection is clearly an issue in Lithuania. If you were bringing tax collection to where it should be in terms of EU average, then you would have more financial capacity to support education and to increase social benefit. So don't put it as the least of your priority. It should be an important priority.
Michele?
Yeah, I mean, just to complement what Benjamin just said, I mean, this is why in the country reports this year, we looked at the same time at public finances, the investment need in the country, but also on structural reforms, because they all have to come together. This is what we define as the virtual triangle that was also put forward in the Anagro survey in the autumn that kind of launches the European semester. At the beginning of June, the Commission will propose a country-specific recommendation for Lithuania, and this year, for the first time, we will have an investment CSR, so a recommendation specifically dedicated to investment, and that will highlight the priorities for the Commission in terms of not just the EU funds, but also private and public investment at national level. So you will see there what our priorities are, but it is true that indeed, these are the areas that we see as important for investment, but they also have to be complemented by the right structural reforms, because otherwise money will be ineffective. And this is why this year and for the next multi-annual financial framework, we are linking the cohesion policy with the European semester more than ever to ensure that the money that is spent in the member states is supported by the right framework, and at the same time that the money that is spent supports the right reform that can make a difference for EU citizens.
Thank you. Now let's take a look at the questions which were submitted by the audience. So let's start with the top one. Lithuania has a very low debt to GDP ratio, well below Maastricht criteria. That said, how you explain such a low expenditure for social benefits, reducing poverty? Angel, or?
Maybe take a few, because we have 14.
Okay. So, yeah, there's one which is maybe to some extent related. So do you think that there is a contradiction between more powerful social protection system and the economic performance? Do you think that, let's say, the higher tax to GDP ratio could burden the, let's say, attractiveness for investment in international sphere, let's say, what is provided as an argument for, let's say, staying quite low low tax share compared to GDP?
Well, you're asking one of the most difficult questions. It's a question of collective choice, basically. There is no single solution to this question. Let me try to elaborate a bit. First, our EU rules do not prescribe a given model. If you take, for instance, all the Maastricht rules and with all the ink which has been put into explaining them, they are not here to prescribe any given models. They are here to say, whatever the model you pick, you need to be sure that you have some kind of sound management of your public finances. You can have a sound management of your public finances with a balanced budget or a small surplus with a public spending level at 60% of GDP, and you can have a balanced budget with a public level at 30% of GDP, and the society behind it is completely different. So we do not prescribe a given model. Second remark, there are different ways sometimes of achieving the same thing. And you have countries which, for instance, tackle very well the inequality via the tax system. You have other countries which tackle rather the inequality via social transfer. You cannot disconnect completely the two, because if you want to do social transfer, you need tax income by definition. But you can also prioritize on how you spend. And it's quite interesting when you see one of the slides that was part of my presentation comparing the correction of inequality, that Lithuania is among the countries that correct the least the inequality, and Ireland is among the countries correcting the most the inequalities. And the common point between the two is that the two have a rather low tax system with low taxation. So it does show that there is not a single way to correct inequality, and indeed each society has to do its collective choices. But what we're saying is that the direction that is correcting inequality and make sure that we have a balanced growth that benefits to everyone and not only to a few is a direction that is very much needed. We have seen a populistic party pushing to relatively high level in a high number of member states. There are a number of reasons behind it, but clearly inequalities and imbalance in the income distribution are very often a common factor behind the support to those parties, where people that feel left over from growth. And this is what you have to pay attention at, clearly. There's no single way of doing it. You can do it via increasing taxes, which is never a very popular prescription for any government in any country. You can do it by prescribing, by distributing differently your tax income. You can try to boost, certainly, your tax income by improving tax collections, so you have to spend more. There are many things you can do, but it has to be done.
Well, maybe only to complement what Benjamin says, and it's also the case. And when speaking about taxes, there are different type of taxes, of course, and those that are maybe easily taxable, like alcohol, tobacco, etc., 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 which could be received in the public as more acceptable than the others, and especially when it comes to the salaries. But what is important to have in mind when addressing inequalities, that we really need to address those that are most disadvantaged, and this is the population that is the target population when you want to address the inequalities. So we have seen that many of our member states have different universal benefits of various kinds, and then the question is, how much do you invest in the universal benefits, or how much you invest or increase or top up in those that are vulnerable or are at the risk of poverty, because indeed the indicator defining people at the risk of the poverty is a very important one, because not only those that are below the threshold, but those that are around thresholds. And we could see that many movements in the EU have been happening around people who are around the threshold and those who are working and having low salaries. So in-work poverty, I think, is one of the challenges that many of our member states face, and that European society in general is facing. And I would say next generation of the benefits and next generation of those that really address inequality are going to be around those cohorts. And it's always important to have it in mind, not only because we deal with the social policy, but because the most disadvantaged ones are the ones who are really being seen as the weakest members of the society in every member state, so, as well as in Lithuania as well.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, we have received even more specific question: what tax to GDP ratio could be reached within 5 years, not hindering economic growth? But probably we cannot be so specific answering this. Marius, would you like to comment?
If my colleague from the Ministry of Finance could say, you know, I can't comment on that.
Yeah. We have received quite specific question on one Lithuanian government initiative, intention to implement voucher system to promote small shopkeepers, local farmers, and young families. But I think this one should be more dedicated to Directorate General responsible for competition, where Lithuanian government now should send a notification. So maybe we can skip this question. Audronė Sadauskaitė is asking about the definition of innovative SMEs. So if you allow, we will transfer this question to the second panel, which will deal with regional policy. Another question: is minimum income regarded as sufficient given its 50% of minimum consumption basket? So more than half money allocated for social assistance is saved early.
Well,
I guess this is about adequacy of social payments.
Yes,
so
it's the overall adequacy, and it's the level, and it's really difficult to say right now and to say at this moment. But it's important to have the adequacy and decent living conditions and decent living standards at all time. And it also depends to whom is this addressed. Is it working age population? Is it old age? Is it reflecting the pensioners or some other cohort? So this is a very difficult question, and I think it also falls under the governmental challenges to be seen. And if all the reforms and if all the elements are taken on board, then this question would be easily addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Do you think that 6 reforms of the Lithuanian government will be enough to address the issues identified in the report? Benjamin.
Well, the president of the European Commission, when he was still Prime Minister of Luxembourg, said once, governments do not need to be told what structural reforms they should do. They know it very well. What they don't know is how to win the elections the day after. Structural reforms are always very difficult, but I must say I found the presentation of Marius extremely interesting. And as he said in his introduction, we certainly agree on the direction. I think what you have listed are clearly the priorities for Lithuania, and they match very well the priorities identified in our report, which is positive. Now, implementation will be the key. And implementation is not only the responsibility of the government, it's a collective responsibility of all tax citizens. All citizens. Now, that's my obsession with taxes, obviously. But taxes actually are a good illustration of what I'm providing. The government can take efforts to fight tax evasion, but at the end of the day, the results will depend on the individual action of each and every Lithuanian citizen and on their collective sense of responsibility. So it is important when you design a reform program such as a six-pack to build ownership, because the ownership of the population is the key to the success in the implementation of the reform.
Marius, would you like to add?
I can only agree that everything depends on implementation. In some areas, of course, some additional actions will need to be taken. And that's a natural thing. Probably you need to adapt. Everything depends on what is politically feasible at a certain stage. You know, what agreement could be reached, you know, within society in general and so on. So the focus should be on implementation. Even with the innovation reform, in that case, also, I can only, conclude, given what I know and how things are happening, everything depends on implementation. But what we are doing and what is different, at this government, that all those reforms are supervised by a certain committee chaired by the Prime Minister. There is a list of reforms that needs to be done. There are projects for each reform, and projects are supervised. So if the actions are correct there, so basically there is big pressure to deliver. But even, when it goes, from the government to the parliament, there are discussions there, so ownership is also key in order to deliver.
Yes, thank you. We have two more questions which are related with economic outlook, so maybe I could ask Benjamin. So, what do you think if Lithuanian budget has enough of stabilization power, having in mind the general slowdown in EU and in the world, and looking into the forecast, let's say if some risks materialize, such as hard Brexit, do you think that Lithuania could be impacted strongly?
Well, you're asking to look into the crystal ball, which is always the most foggy exercise by definition. First, on the question whether you have sufficient macroeconomic stabilizer, well, you still have a surplus. So as such, by definition, there is a buffer for economic stabilization. That said, the recent tax reform is creating potentially 1% of GDP, I wouldn't say shortage, but question mark on whether this is properly financed or not. You have room. You have room with this level of deficit and debt. Not a big room, but you have room. Now, channels of contagion. Clearly, Lithuania would not be strongly affected by Brexit as a first-round effect, but Lithuania could be affected as a second-round effect via other countries which themselves are more affected. That said, overall, we do not expect Brexit to be a major shock for the euro area and for the European Union. If you take the EU, the euro area at the wall. The problem is that it would create, if there is an hard Brexit, which no one knows at this stage, if there is an hard Brexit, it would translate into an asymmetric shock for some economies. And that is the case, for instance, for Ireland, and to a lower extent for the Netherlands. Some other would be also relatively affected without having a shock to the similar extent, such as Sweden. What we see more than Brexit as mattering behind the slowdown is clearly the evolution of world trade and the significant trade tension which are at play. The US growth is revised downward, the Chinese growth is revised downward, the Japanese growth is revised downward. So for an economy such as the one of the euro area, which is extremely dependent on export, we have one of the biggest current account surplus in the world. By definition, we are extremely exposed to world trade slowdown. And for the biggest economy of the euro area, which is Germany, that is key. So if on top of it you had, God prevents, trade sanction in the US on cars, which would trigger a further slowdown in Germany, which has already been close in the last quarter to a technical recession, then the effect on the euro as a whole would be pretty significant. I understand that Lithuania is very exposed to the area, which is primarily almost 2/3 of its trade, but not exclusively to the area. Russia is also a very important trading partner, for instance. So the Brexit effect would not be comparable to the difficulty of experience via the slowdown in Russia. analyze the effects of Russian sanctions as was last year. It would be much, much smaller. But no one is immune. So if there is Brexit on top of trade tension, then very clearly the euro area gross performance would be affected, and the gross performance of Lithuania would be affected as well. We have already factored in a decrease of export as a driving factor behind growth. As I said in my presentation now, growth in Lithuania is primarily led by domestic factor. As long as you keep building on those domestic factors, which are primarily wage increase, etc., this will remain. So I'm not saying that Lithuania will enter into recession, but you could enter into a protracted period of slow growth. I think Norman started his introduction by saying that we have been through a 7 years period of growth. So let's hope that we will not enter into the symmetric opposite 7 years biblical period from now on, which depends very much on making the right investment for preparing the future.
Thank you. As we are running out of time, let's pick one question and let's transfer all others to the second panel in the afternoon. So let's take a very general one. The graph on the recommendations implementation level, so probably it's the first graph which was shown by Marius, shows that countries are not following Commission advice very strictly. Why and what can be done? So maybe a few words each. Thank you.
So I tried to give a certain answer that you need to focus your attention. I think both in the recommendations, and then the Commission needs to ask, the government to do the same, to give focused answers. But at the same time, we fully agree we have these kind of discussions within government too. What is the purpose of recommendations? So basically, these are political recommendations to start a discussion in order to create a certain political consensus what needs to be done. So I think we should look at those recommendations from this side. It's very valuable for the government to have an external view to see what is happening. Sometimes you need someone. There is a saying in Lithuania that in your own town you won't be a prophet. So sometimes you need someone outside to point, to those painful things that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And as it was said before, the purpose of the European semester is not to be there and criticize the member states. The purpose of the European semester is to empower national government and support them in doing the right reforms. Of course, if there are imbalances that could create issues and destabilize the European Union as a whole, we have a process which is the macroeconomic imbalances procedures that foresees a number of steps, but Lithuania is not in this category. So we have a process of CSRs, which is, as it was said before by the Vice Minister, the main purpose, after all, is that of giving visibility and increasing the political capital of the reform that need to be done. And also the Commission put in place two type of mechanisms to help the reform. One is, of course, the structural reform support program. Just to remind you that Lithuania has benefited in the last, in 2017, 18 and 19, of 37 projects for almost 5.5 million. So the way we do it is the European semester identifies the what, and the SRSP kind of identifies the how and how to do it. From this year onward, we went one step further. As I said before, which is to try and better combine the structural reform with investment. So we will link the use of EU funds to the European semester, and this is already increasing visibility of the process and of the overall implementation. There was also another question to conclude. I mean, a lot of also these CSRs are have a longer horizon. So in theory, the recommendations focus on reforms that can be implemented within 12 to 18 months, but is not always the case. Or if the reform can be implemented with these time horizons, the impact of the reform takes longer. So far, the CSR have been quite short-term, but the impact of the reform takes longer, and this is why we also monitor the multi-annual implementation. So the figures that were shown before were a snapshot of the implementation, but we're also looking at the multi-annual implementation. And this year, for the first time, we shared this analysis also with the member states. And then to conclude my part, because I will not attend in the next seminar, I would like to thank all of you, both from being here for your interest, but also for the support that you've given to the process. The country report is the result of a continuous dialogue that we had with the national authorities and with stakeholders. They started with the European semester mission in the autumn. And I would like to thank those of you that met us back in November to inform this very report. The next phase will, of course, be the National Reform Program that we will expect in the course of this month. And again, the member states are invited to involve as much as possible stakeholders and social partners. So we're looking forward to receiving the response, which I assume will be somewhere along the line of the presentation of the Vice Minister today on the reforms that you have in place to continue this dialogue that will then further lead to the recommendations that I referred to before on the 7th of June. Thank you.
Okay, so let us finish this first part. So thank you very much for listening and attending. I just would like to remind that the welcome coffee to the second part starts at 12:30, and at 1 o'clock we start the session.